I think for me, the ego is the simplest term of it's your unconscious brain. Every single one of us has it. We all are usually driven by it. It's the unconscious habits, mindsets, and beliefs that we don't realize are making our decisions and sabotaging our good intentions every single day, 95% of the time.
Hello and welcome to Love as a Business Strategy, a podcast that brings humanity to the workplace. We're here to talk about business, but we want to tackle topics that most business leaders shy away from. We believe that humanity and love should be at the center of every successful business. I'm your host, Jeff Ma, and as always, I'm here to have conversations and hear stories about how real people and real businesses operate. My guest today is Christie Garcia. Christie is an ego management expert. She's a speaker, facilitator. She's contributed to Forbes Coaches Council, and she's the founder of the Mindful Choice Leadership Academy. She has 19 years of experience in sales, recruiting, and leadership development. For the last decade, she's worked with current and upcoming leaders from fast-growing orgs like Airbnb, Twitter, Movement for Life, Sunrun, and Oakley. Christie builds programs that help individuals and teams maximize their impact through self-awareness, ownership, communication, alignment, and accountability. Some of my favorite words. One of Christie's superpowers is helping her clients identify and manage their ego in real time. She helps her clients build authentic confidence so they can communicate more effectively and maximize their impact within their professional teams and personal relationships. So, Christie, in love with your bio already.
Thank you.
So many things, but welcome to the show. How are you? How are you doing?
Thanks, Jeff. I'm fantastic. I'm super excited about your show and just talking with you and your listeners and seeing where the conversation takes us today.
Absolutely. And just the way that when I first heard ego, that can go a lot of different directions and all these things.
Absolutely.
But hearing a little bit more about how you focus on it, I'm just so excited to dive into that. And it's like speaking my language, but in a new way. And I always love that.
Awesome.
But before we dive into that, I do want to just kind of start with you as a person, as a human. What brought you to today? What is your path to this ego management expertise?
Such a great question. I think there were several things, like in life, there's always a path that leads us to where we're at. But I think the really obvious one was, I guess, 12 years ago now, I had a 30-foot fall. And that was kind of my eye-opening moment that shed light on my ego and really showed me where my ego was making me just believe that life was so fulfilling and so great and so full. I think I was happy. I think I was satisfied, but it was from a very small lens and a short-term perspective. And so, being able to go through that fall, have to slow down for a couple weeks. It really shed light to where I realized that just my relationships weren't as meaningful. I was living this really great life, but I knew I wanted more. And that really showed me, got me curious. I had already started kind of training as a coach and going through the life coaching side of things, learning how to transition it into business. And this was kind of that whoa, aha moment. This is how the ego sabotages our life. This is how ego drives us to focus so much on our career and so much on our success that we forget what really is important until something happens. And it's usually a crisis, right? Whether it's a death in your family, whether it's an illness, whether it's a family member, getting sick. There's something that always gets us to that moment of aha. And this was mine. And, I feel like I had to build this business to hopefully catch people before that day comes, because either one, you miss out on so many great things on the life side of your world, or two, you just sabotage your career. So you work so much harder than you actually have to, because that ego is just constantly driving you and telling you you're not doing a good enough job. So that's kind of where, high level, quick, short story of how we got here and how I started building the Ego Management Leadership Academy.
Several follow-up questions.
Right. That was a loaded statement.
So let me peel back. let's start with the word ego, I guess. Let me
Mhm.
start there, because when I hear ego, I can go anywhere from simply pride all the way to one of the supervillains in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So
Right.
when you say ego, what can you define that for us a little bit?
Yeah. I think for me, the ego is the simplest term of it's your unconscious brain. Every single one of us has it. We all are usually driven by it. It's the unconscious habits, mindsets, and beliefs that we don't realize are making our decisions and sabotaging our good intentions every single day, 95% of the time. So I use it as there's three egos: the complier, the protector, and the controller, and breaking them down to where it really is just normalizing the human behaviors, the human habits that show up that really sabotage our leadership, our relationships, and how we show up in the world.
So when you work in ego, are you working to adjust these mindsets, just create self-awareness around them, or what is the approach specifically?
Yeah, all of the above. I think self-awareness and ownership is step one. You have to be self-aware in order to even recognize that there's an ego involved. And then step two is the ownership part of it. Once you know it's there, now you have to own it. Because a lot of us will say, oh yeah, I'm aware that I do that, but I'm a jerk. That's just me, take it or leave it. Well, that's not really a true statement. That's someone that doesn't know exactly what to do with that information, right? And so being able to not just become aware of it, but deeply understand the why behind it. Why do I do this? Because once you understand why you do something, it's very easy to change it. If you don't understand why, it's just a thing you do and you don't really understand the motivators. Once we understand how the egos are showing up, there's very specific motivators for each one. And everything kind of starts to make sense. All the confrontations that you have or conflicts that you have arise in your days. It's like, oh, I get it now. That ego is driving me there. Or, being able to recognize when you are struggling, feeling like you're out of control. And so you're over controlling everything. Or maybe you don't feel like you're in control of anything. And so you just proactively shut down and go passive and just kind of go with the flow because it's easier than rocking the boat or stirring up any emotions for anybody else. And so again, recognizing the why behind what we do.
I love that. And that's something I subscribe to very much myself. And I think that self-awareness in our context, let's just talk about, leaders or people in business that are, of course, this applies to someone's entire life, but in work itself, I think self-awareness, we're very much blind to so many of our own shortcomings and things like that.
Yes.
Is there anything you can say about egos in particular? Because I think ego, to me, from your early definition, it feels like ego is something that's even more hard to find, maybe even harder to be vulnerable to admit to for yourself even.
Absolutely. A lot of times the ego, it's sneaky. It's, it is unconscious. So until you bring a consciousness around it, there are habits and behaviors that we usually are ashamed of, right? It's the ones that we'd be embarrassed to have to admit that we do that. It's the mean side of all of us. It's the one that's too busy to slow down for the people, or it's the one that, puts people before yourself. And so you get taken advantage of all the time and you become the victim of your own life or circumstance. And so it's something that emotionally can make us feel ashamed. I think that's the ultimate thing people go through when they start to identify the ego. Going back to the word pride, the pride that we all have to show up with our mask on, to show that we've got it all put together, or to show that, we're this, image of perfection, whatever that is for us. And being able to just say, hey, actually, I'm not perfect. I have these flaws and these are my brilliant fails. And this is how I got here. And I'm still okay. I think that's the genuine ego management we like to get to, is a place of just authentic confidence. It's the good, bad, and ugly. And we get to accept it all because we're all human. And as leaders, the beauty of it is it actually makes you a more powerful leader, because too many leaders become unrelatable. That ego wants to isolate us, wants to put us on an island. It wants to make people wrong. It wants to judge people. It wants to criticize people, accuse, assume bad intentions. It does all of the yucky things that humans do to each other. And when we can just recognize that that's an ego tactic, that's an unconscious behavior. So when you or someone else is doing that, it's not a conscious behavior. Even if we feel like we're super conscious in the moment, your best self is not present when that's happening. And I think that's the real power of being able to recognize how that ego is showing up. It's both our strengths and our weaknesses. It's not all bad. And I think a lot of times people think, oh, how do we get rid of the ego? The ego's not going anywhere. It's how do you get to manage the ego and use it in your favor, to use it so it serves you and everybody around you versus it unconsciously sabotaging the success, the good intentions, and the relationships that you're having.
So you broke ego down to 3 types, I believe, or elements, I believe. Is that fundamental to the work and the teaching, or do people have more of one than the other, or can you break that down a little bit more?
Absolutely. So there's three ego types that we use in Mindful Choice: the complier, the protector, and the controller. We all have 1 to 2 dominant egos naturally. They start to show up when we're age 2, 3. Our childhood experiences, our parenting, our parents' parenting style, our sibling, lineup, any traumas or crises that we go through. That all dictates how we show up in the world. And it starts to create these egos. The ego was once designed to protect us. So as a kid, it's, the protector ego is there. Hey, that's dangerous. Back away. Do this for safety, right? So if it's a shy child, maybe they learn that, hey, if I'm in the, if I stay in the shadows, no one will notice me and I won't get picked on. And how that translates as you get older, right? Now you're in a board room, and if I don't speak up, no one will question whether or not I should be here. And so that's, again, where that ego, as it grows with us, it starts to sabotage us. Maybe it was the athlete as a child. You learned that if you're really good at sports or you're straight A's in your class, then you get praised and everybody will love you. And so again, that's how the ego once served us. Once we start to get into our 20s, we start to have more relationships where it becomes more of a little bit of a we that is involved. And so as you get into, partnerships, personally, friendships that are, more meaningful than maybe some childhood relationships, you start to get into leadership roles. It's no longer about me. And the ego is very driven on, how do I be liked? How do I make sure I'm right? How do I make sure I win and I'm the best? And there's a evolution here where now we have to shift to we. If you're the only one at the finish line, you really don't win when you're an adult. And so making sure that you shift. With the 3 types, the controller is motivated by being the best and winning. So it's the results first, people second. This is where success is our driver. We thrive on challenges and hard things, and we're constantly, striving for the next big thing. Unfortunately, with this comes micromanagement, over controlling, perfectionism, all those things that can drive us to push people away. The protector is all about high integrity, authenticity, speaking truth, strong value system. Unfortunately, with that also comes stubborn, black and white thinking, my way or the highway. Their motivator is I have to be right in order to have value or to be worthwhile. And so you can see how that could definitely create some insecurities or some issues when you're talking about collaboration or growing as a leader. And then you have your complier, who is motivated by being liked, warm, inviting, super caring, lots of compassion. Unfortunately, that can lead to struggles to make hard decisions, can't have the difficult conversations or give feedback because they're scared of the emotional responses or creating conflict or rocking the boat. And so they tend to be more passive and kind of goes along to get along versus speaking up and holding results. So, that's where you can see all of them have strengths, all of them have weaknesses. The idea is great leaders use all 3. You can pull from the complier to get the empathy, the compassion, people, bring the people along. You've got the protector, which speaks truth. It's no longer about me, it's about the greater we, and this is what's good for everybody. And then you've got the controller, who is results oriented. Let's do it this way. Let's get to the finish line. Let's make sure we get the results, because outcomes matter too, right? None of us would be here if there wasn't a paycheck at the end of the day. And so, making sure it's a full package versus leaning one way or the other.
This is really, really insightful. I'm literally processing myself right now as you go. So it's amazing. But where do you draw the line, or at least help people see kind of the divide between, let's say, quote, I am who I am, or that's just how I am, and these elements of ego within them? Like,
I
a
love
lot
that
of
statement.
a lot of the things you just said feel like ways that people almost define themselves, pride themselves in, maybe
Mhm.
have worked to even develop in that way.
Absolutely.
How do you kind of balance that out for people?
There's a very clear, when people start to recognize their ego, it becomes a very clear visceral awareness. Then you can start to see, is this my best self, or is this a belief or something I've told myself? And I think the reality of ego management is, when typically when people say, well, I am who I am, just deal with it. If you were to really start digging into that thought, just from a coaching, psychological mindset, you can break that down pretty quickly, because that's an insecure driver. That's something like that's a safety comment. When you start saying, well, tell me more about that. Why are you that way? What is your motivator behind that? Most people can't answer that, right? Because that's an ego statement. And I think when you start to get curious and you really are wanting to understand, your bigger motivators and wanting to approve, then those statements don't last for too long. Now, where that statement is powerful, because again, every strength has a weakness, every weakness has a strength. And I think there's strength in saying, this is who I am, take it or leave it, right? When you get to a place of ego management, when that statement is real. When you get to say, hey, this is my best self. And this is just, this is the line I draw, and I'm going to stand here because I know this is right. And I'll be able to look myself in the eye at the end of the day and say I did the right thing. So there is a point where we want that ego to hold us strong. But again, it's an intentional ego action versus the unconscious that's typically driven by insecurity. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. And it brings me to kind of thinking about this from this self-awareness perspective again. It feels like these egos within us, they're defined by how we engage with others. Would that be accurate to some extent?
Absolutely.
So a lot of what you're saying is very introspective. It's very looking within yourself and asking why, which I am a big fan of. But I also feel like self-awareness has a second kind of piece to it, right? It's a bit of a gap between how you think you're perceived or interacting with others and how you're actually interacting with others. So where do people gain that other data point from? How do we actually understand our realities of our ego? Is it something we can find within ourselves holistically, or do we need help?
Personally, I think it's a combination of both. You only know what you're willing to see, right? And I think that's the one thing where the ego is really smart, and it can tell you all day, every day that you're doing a great job or you're not doing a good enough job. And it's probably telling you a combination of both, depending on what the situation is. Where I think when you can truly gain self-awareness, there has to be a level of external feedback, being able to ask people, how did that land? What did that, feel like for you? Or even just being able to observe that and then get curious when you obviously know that something didn't land right. Most of us know when our intentions didn't land, right? The room gets quiet, someone starts to kick back, everybody's getting triggered, even you might be getting triggered. So depending on your ego type, if you're more on the control or protector side, you're going to get more of that fiery, like combative, I need to fight and, get on my soapbox and tell them why I'm right. Or it could be on the people side where all of a sudden you're like, whoa, this is getting too heated. I'm super uncomfortable and I'm going to start shutting down and playing small. And so again, knowing when does that intentional impact not land, and you can start to actually get curious in those moments. But I think realistically, in order to truly understand your ego, you have to be willing to go external. Otherwise, your ego will make up all the stories and tell you what you want to hear, and you'll continue to buy your own press.
As I process, I see myself in all three of these egos quite a bit.
Yep.
So here I am. I'm seeing that. I'm taking some first steps to really recognizing and becoming a little more self-aware. What do I do about it? What do I do from here tangibly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the reality is we do all have all three ego types. Now, again, typically we have 1 to 2 dominant ones that show up more regularly, but certain people trigger different ego types. Egos are driven by emotion. And so, let's say personally, in your personal life, you might be more of a complier protector, but in your professional life, you come across as more of a protector controller. That's all very normal stuff. Now, where you want to take that level of self-awareness, once you start to recognize, okay, I have these egos, these are the motivators behind them. Now it's recognizing in real time. Okay, we got to take full ownership of them, right? Not just say I know them and I'm aware of them, but actually recognizing when they show up. We have a tool that actually gives you very specific behaviors of how these egos show up. For example, again, the ego of the complier shows up as not speaking up, holding back your truth. I'm fine is a really big statement of the complier. Everything's good. I'm fine. Don't worry about me. I'm okay, right? Those are things that start to show up regularly. And once you start noticing the cues or the behaviors, it's very easy to identify them in real time. And then you can actually catch yourself, because then you can say, oh, wow, I'm doing it right now. Now I can get curious. So 1, you have to take self-awareness. 2, there's got to be ownership. Once you take ownership of your ego, now you can actually start to ego manage, which means you got to slow down. The ego moves fast, thinks fast, and acts fast. And so slow it down and get curious. Ask first, tell second. When you start to feel, let's say, the burning in your chest, or your ears get hot, or you get your cheeks, get all fiery, whatever your symptom is of when your ego shows up, recognizing that. And the more aware you become of it, the sooner you can catch it. And the ego is never going to go away. So you're going to always have it. This is a lifelong journey. But, some people don't catch it for 5 days. Some people don't catch it for 5 months. If you can catch it, sooner than 5 days or sooner than 5 months, you're now already more aware of your ego, right? And that's always what I tell people. Just be 1% better every day. If you can catch your ego 5 minutes earlier, you can actually start ego management and damage control 5 minutes earlier. And so that's really the power of this. Nothing technically has to change. It's just allowing you to be aware of your actions and making sure that your good intentions are actually what's landing, going back to that perception. Perception is not always truth, but it is reality. And when you can catch yourself in that reality where the perception is not meeting what you want it to be doing, that's when you can actually start to shift it in real time. Just by being curious, why does this matter to me? Why does it matter to them? What's triggering me in this moment? And how can I make a stronger impact and a more impactful impact? Not to win, not to be right, not to be the best, not to be liked, but just because it's the right thing to do. And this is my best self coming out.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense, that different people bring different types of ego out. Would you say the same is true in terms of like the shift in our lives, changing our dominant egos? For instance, I can see a lot more, let's say, entry-level employees being driven more as a complier, but as they move up, shifting more to protector or controller. Is that something you see?
Not necessarily. I think what happens a lot of times is in our 20s, we start to build our career, we start to build our confidence. Naturally, if you're going to see leaders, there's got to be some level of controller, because you don't climb and you don't get success if there's not some level of controller in that behavior or in that person's personality. Now, with that being said, the controller could be driven by their compliers. So they don't have to be a controller ego in order to have perfectionist tactics. Their motivator could be, if I'm liked, I'll get promoted. In order to be promoted, I need to be the best. So if I'm the best, I'll be liked and I'll be promoted, right? And so I think it's not necessarily saying all leaders have controller protector in them. It could be their secondary or even their third unconscious ego that's being driven by the need to be liked. So yeah, I think that's where we have to get really curious, and the egos will outsmart us. So we might think, we've gotten this taken care of. So a lot of times when people start to ego manage, let's say they are a complier and they know they need to bring in more controlling tactics in order to balance out that the complier ego. With that being said, a lot of times people will start to overuse the controller and underuse their complier. And so we have to make sure we're balancing it all. The sweet spot is about 33%. If we can use the complier, controller, and protector all about 33%, we're really intentionally choosing the strengths of each one. And that's where our best self really lives. That's the sweet spot we can all kind of identify with as like, this feels good. This feels right. I can look myself in the eye and say I did the right thing.
That makes a ton of sense. And now that I understand all the concepts better, I'm curious to go back to your original story of taking a fall. I'm curious if you could elaborate on how that fall led to this realization.
Yeah. So the fall was 9 a.m. in the morning. I was walking my dog. It was raining. And the apartment complex that I was living in kind of naturally locked the door, and I locked myself out. So I got in through my neighbor, and we did this all the time. It was, looking back, it's really stupid. But, you know, we would go through each other's apartment, or we'd go to the roof and crawl down the fire escape and into our kitchen window. Super unsafe, but it made sense because it always worked. And you're locked out. So what else do you do? So anyways, that morning I had my dog. It was raining. So I went to my neighbor, and she said, yeah, or asked her if she could help me because I was decorating for a holiday party I was having that night and had Christmas trees in the window or whatever. So I said, can you come, you know, let my dog stay in your apartment and you hold these Christmas trees while I crawl through my apartment window. Well, needless to say, we went out her bedroom window, which shared the fire escape deck. And that's when I fell through. But I realized there was an ego problem, not necessarily consciously, but in that moment, I had already been doing some personal development around self-awareness and, you know, trusting the process and all that good stuff. But when I hit the ground and the ambulance came, you know, I was in medical cells. And so I was like, okay, you know, can I wiggle my toes? Can I wiggle my fingers? Like, am I good? I'm good. Okay. So I rolled over and I was unconscious for a couple minutes. But so by the time the paramedics came, I was just like go mode. Adrenaline kicked in. And I'm like, I don't have time for this. I want to go to this hospital. Like, let's just do this because I got a party to get back to. And poor paramedic thought I was a complete lunatic. He's like, yeah, ma'am, that's not happening. So they had to take me to the farthest hospital because it was the only trauma-based hospital. And by the time I get there, it was all good. I had tons of tests, but I was out of there in 3 hours. And that's really when it kind of all hit me that I was, well, actually, it was probably 2 weeks later when it, like, the identity of the ego hit me. But in this moment, I'm thinking, I can't cancel my party. Like, we've got friends coming over. We're going to have a good time. It's all good. It's about noon now. Well, of course, the reality is no one wants to come to a party after a girl just fell 30 feet. So we ended up canceling. 2 weeks go by. And I hadn't really had any emotion around it. And I talked to my coach at the time, and she said, Christie, how are you doing? And so I tell her, it's been a crazy 2 weeks. You know, I've had this fall, we had Thanksgiving. It's been really annoying because I can't, you know, really take care of myself right now. And she's like, excuse me, what? And I'm like, yeah, it's really annoying. It's just slowing me down. It's all good. I'm almost back to normal. And so she said, how are you doing? I'm great. I'm good. I'm just, you know, bored and I'm annoyed. She's like, okay, well, how are you doing? And again, I did the whole, I'm great. I'm just annoyed. We're getting through this. And so then she asked one more time, Christie, how are you doing? And I probably had the most expensive cry of my life. I just lost it for about 15 minutes. I could not control my crying. I had no idea what it was coming from. And it actually terrified me because I was not a crier. I was, you know, the only time I cried is when I watched sappy movies. And that was an intentional, like, I'm going to go have a moment. And it was weird. And so that's when I really started to get curious. What does this mean? This was a December. About January, I started learning. I started having a ton of awareness around, like, what is this? This is the unconscious brain. And eventually I started putting some language to it, recognized that I was this controller ego, and it is manipulating my life. The irony is that when I was in medical cells, I would walk the halls and I was really trying, you know, I'd see all these people in the hospital by themselves and it broke my heart. I didn't really understand, why are they here dying by themselves? And so I went into their rooms. I would talk to them on my lunch break. And the most common things I heard were, I worked so hard. I missed out on all the things that were important, or I worked for my family to make things happen, but they were gone by the time I retired. Whatever it was, the story was very similar all the way across. I wasn't there is basically what happened, or I didn't prioritize my personal life. And it hit me in that moment that I was going to create that life for myself. I was going to be alone in a hospital room. The thing I feared the most was the thing I was unconsciously creating. I was almost 30. I hadn't dated in 10 years. I wasn't, building space to buy a home, to have a family, any of the things that I said I wanted. And now here I am 30, super unconscious about it. And so that's really what kind of the big change of perspective was for me. Like, wow, this is how this happens. Life flies by, we make choices, and we're driven by our careers. And I think what really hit me was, it's no longer going to be just men in those hospital rooms. It's going to be women too. So now we have broken families from many different angles, or no families at all, right? We're having this reality that people aren't having kids because they're so involved with their career that before they know it, it's too late, right? And so, I think that just really hit home for me. And I started to build out programs, started to look at things and really say, okay, how do I help change those really successful people? A lot of times at this time, coaching was just really for the problem childs in the businesses. And, it was like, no, this needs to be a proactive thing. We've got to get ahead of this. People are not aware of what they're actually doing. And, that's on the personal side, but really it impacts every relationship at work as well. We lead so hard. We think that being the driver, being the controller, or being the friend is how we're supposed to get ahead. And unfortunately, those all sabotage our success. It's not necessarily getting everybody to the finish line. You might be getting a few ego types to the finish line with you. There might be some simple people on your team, but the higher up you go, the harder those tactics are, and they don't work as well when you start getting into higher level leadership.
I really appreciate you sharing that personal story, but an inspirational story. I think that's a really great story to hear for myself, and I know the listeners, because it really puts a lot into perspective, helps us really appreciate a lot more, and maybe take pause and look at our own lives and egos and other potentially hidden drivers in our life. So I really appreciate you for sharing that with us.
Absolutely. It's my big purpose. Help people recognize, are you really happy? And are you building success in every category? Because it doesn't have to just be one category.
Well, Christie, I really appreciate you joining me today at this conversation. It's been really informative, but also very motivational and kind of inspiring to share this space with you. So thank you for taking the time and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure visiting with you. I love the conversations you're having and the wisdom you're bringing to people. It's really insightful and motivating as well.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. And I appreciate our listeners who hopefully have already read the book, but if you haven't, please check it out. Always a shameless plug for that at the end of every episode. So Love is a Business Strategy. And if you haven't, please subscribe, rate, podcast, all the good things, help us out. And we hope you're appreciating it and enjoying all this. I know, talks with people like Christie are kind of what keep me going every day. So hopefully it's helping somebody out there as well, and that would be worth it. So with that, thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.